In a dusty Midwestern town square, a seamstress's daughter was about to make the purchase that would change everything. What started as a simple auction took a shocking turn when she bid her last 60 cents on what everyone called a cursed building. Margaret Whitlow wasn't your typical small-town woman. For years she had spent her life observing what others overlooked, known for seeing potential where others saw only decay. When she encountered the abandoned bakery's hidden secrets, she had no idea she was walking into a dangerous legacy that powerful men had tried to bury. Margaret's determination to uncover the truth would lead to a confrontation that threatened everything she'd fought to build. What began as a desperate gamble would become a community revolution. The town would never be the same after discovering what Henry Barlow had really left behind in those crumbling walls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She bought an abandoned bakery for 60 cents, then found what no merchant dared to touch. Margaret Whitlow stood at the edge of the crowd in the dusty town square, clutching her last coins while the wealthiest men in the territory laughed at the spectacle before them. The autumn auction had drawn every prominent businessman within 50 miles, but not for the reasons she had hoped. 60 cents, the auctioneer called out, his voice cracking with disbelief. Do I hear 65? Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. Thomas Carver, owner of the largest grain mill in 3 counties, wiped tears of laughter from his weathered cheeks. His expensive suit and gold pocket watch caught the afternoon sunlight as he turned to his associates. Still chuckling, "Some people never learn their place," he announced loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "That girl's about to throw away her last coins on a pile of rotting timber." Maggie's face burned with humiliation, but she kept her hand raised. The bakery sat before them like a broken tooth in an otherwise respectable row of businesses. Its windows were boarded shut, paint peeled from its wooden siding in long, curling strips, and the front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. For 3 years it had stood empty after old Henry Barlow's mysterious closure, growing more decrepit with each passing season. Every businessman in the territory had walked past that building countless times, dismissing it as worthless. But Maggie had seen something during her brief inspection the week before, something that made her palms sweat as she counted her meager savings. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. Sold to Miss Whitlow for 60 cents. The crowd erupted in a mixture of laughter and disbelief. Mrs. Adelaide Lyle, the town's most notorious gossip, immediately turned to her neighbor. "That poor child has lost her mind completely, throwing away her inheritance on that cursed place." Thomas Carver stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wooden platform as he approached Maggie. His smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for children and simpletons. "Miss Whitlow," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I do hope you'll reconsider this purchase. That building has stood empty for good reason. Even old Barlow was glad to abandon it in the end." Maggie accepted the iron key from the auctioneer, its weight surprising in her small palm. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Carver, but I believe I can see potential where others see only problems." Carver's smile faltered slightly. "Potential?" He glanced back at his associates, who had gathered closer to witness the exchange. "My dear girl, the only potential in that ruin is for collapse. You could have used those coins for a decent meal and warm lodging. Sometimes what appears worthless on the surface holds the greatest value underneath," Maggie replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. A flicker of something irritation, perhaps even suspicion, crossed Carver's features before the condescending smile returned. "Mark my words, Miss Whitlow, some things are left abandoned for good reason. Smart people learn to recognize when they're in over their heads." As the crowd began to disperse, still muttering about the foolish seamstress's daughter who had thrown away her future, Maggie stood alone before her purchase. The rusty key felt warm in her clenched fist, and somewhere deep in her chest, excitement battled with terror. Behind her she could hear Thomas Carver instructing Sheriff Dugan to keep an eye on that property. The implication in his voice was clear. He expected trouble, perhaps even hoped for it. But as Maggie approached the crooked door, something inside the building seemed to shift. Not a sound exactly, more like a settling, as if the very walls were awakening after years of sleep. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the square, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard the faint echo of voices from within. The bakery waited, patient and secretive, holding whatever truth had driven its previous owner to abandon it so mysteriously. Whatever that truth was, it now belonged to her. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting for exactly this moment. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo longer than it should, revealing an interior shrouded in dusty shadows and the lingering scent of old flour. Maggie stepped across the threshold, her boots echoing on wooden floors that, despite the building's exterior decay, felt solid beneath her feet. Shafts of autumn sunlight penetrated the boarded windows through gaps and cracks, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets, waiting to be revealed. The bakery was larger than it appeared from outside. Behind the main shop area, she could see the shadowy outline of the kitchen, where massive brick ovens dominated the far wall. Shelves lined the walls, still holding empty flour sacks and rusted baking tins. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, yet underneath the neglect, she sensed something more, a feeling that this place had been preserved, rather than simply abandoned. A soft whimper from behind made her turn. A scraggly yellow dog sat in the doorway, its ribs showing through matted fur, watching her with intelligent brown eyes. "Well, hello there," Maggie said softly, extending her hand. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing her fingers before allowing a gentle pat. "You look as hungry as I feel. What do you say we explore this place together?" The dog, she decided to call him Biscuit, followed her deeper into the shop. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, details emerged that made her pause. The flour bins along the wall bore carved markings that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Not random scratches, but symbols etched with purpose into the wood. Biscuit had wandered toward the kitchen area and was now pawing insistently at a particular section of floorboard. His whining grew more urgent as Maggie approached. "What is it, boy? What have you found?" She knelt beside him and pressed her hand to the spot he'd been scratching. The board felt different from the others, looser somehow, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. When she pushed down, it gave slightly, revealing a gap around its edges. Rising, she continued her exploration, running her fingers along the carved symbols on the flour bins. The markings were weathered, but still visible, geometric patterns interspersed with what looked like letters or numbers. They reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. In the kitchen, she discovered more mysteries. The massive brick ovens showed signs of recent use, despite the building's 3-year abandonment. Soot still clung to their mouths, and the smell of old fires lingered in the air. On a shelf above the largest oven, she found a collection of glass jars, most empty, but some still containing dried herbs she didn't recognize. But it was the scrap of paper tucked behind one of the jars that made her heart race. Written in faded ink was what appeared to be a recipe, but unlike any she'd ever seen, for strength in lean times: wheat flour 2 parts, dried nettle 1 handful, root of wild turnip ground fine, bake when the moon is dark, speak the old words. The rest was torn away, leaving only tantalizing fragments. Biscuit had returned to his position by the loose floorboard, his pawing more insistent now. Maggie crouched beside him again, working her fingers around the edges of the board until she could lift it slightly. Beneath was darkness, but the smell that emerged was not the mustiness she expected. Instead, it carried hints of rosemary and something else, something medicinal and clean. "What secrets were you keeping, Henry Barlow?" she whispered to the empty air. As if in response, a board creaked overhead, though she was certain no one else was in the building. The sound was followed by a soft scratching, like mice in the walls, but rhythmic, almost purposeful. The afternoon light was fading, and Maggie knew she should leave before full darkness fell. But as she prepared to go, she noticed something else, a leather-bound book wedged between two flour sacks on a high shelf. When she pulled it free, clouds of flour dust made her sneeze, but her excitement only grew. The book was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. The first entry was dated 15 years ago, written in the same careful hand as the recipe fragment. The old ways are not lost, only hidden. What our grandmothers knew, I will preserve. The town may forget, but the earth remembers, and the ovens will hold their secrets until someone worthy comes to claim them. Maggie clutched the journal to her chest, her pulse quickening. Henry Barlow hadn't simply abandoned this place. He had left it waiting for someone. The question was, waiting for what? And why had Thomas Carver been so insistent that she would regret her purchase? Biscuit whined softly, pressing against her legs as shadows deepened around them. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the town settling into evening routines, but inside the bakery she felt utterly alone with mysteries that seemed to pulse with life of their own. She would return tomorrow with lamp oil and proper tools. Whatever Henry Barlow had hidden beneath those floorboards, whatever secrets those carved symbols protected, she would uncover them all. But for now, she carefully tucked the journal inside her coat and headed for the door, Biscuit trotting faithfully beside her. As she turned for one last look at her 60-cent purchase, a final shaft of sunlight illuminated the carved symbols on the flour bins, and for just a moment they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The bakery's secrets would have to wait, but they would not wait long. The next morning found Maggie walking the dusty path to the schoolhouse, Henry Barlow's journal wrapped carefully in brown paper beneath her arm. Eleanor Fields had always been different from the other women in town, sharper, more questioning, less concerned with gossip than with truth. If anyone would remember the real story behind the bakery's closure, it would be Nora. The schoolhouse sat at the town's eastern edge, a simple wooden building surrounded by oak trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold. Maggie found Nora sweeping the front steps, her dark hair pinned back severely but her eyes bright with intelligence. "Margaret Whitlow," Nora said, leaning on her broom. "I heard about your purchase yesterday. The whole town's buzzing like a hive that's been kicked. That's why I'm here." Maggie glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I need to know about Henry Barlow. The real story, not the rumors." Nora's expression grew serious. She set down her broom and gestured toward the schoolhouse steps. "Sit with me. This conversation requires privacy." They settled side by side on the worn wooden steps, the morning sun warming their faces. Nora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Henry Barlow was a good man," she began finally. "Quiet, but good. He came to this town about 20 years ago, bought that building from old Mrs. Henderson, and set up his bakery. For the first few years, everything was ordinary: bread, rolls, the occasional wedding cake. What changed? The famine summer." Nora's voice dropped. 7 years ago. You probably don't remember it clearly. You would have been just a girl. But that summer the rains failed completely. Crops withered in the fields, cattle died, and people began to starve. Maggie nodded, remembering her mother's worried whispers about empty pantries and the weight she'd lost. That terrible season. Thomas Carver controlled most of the grain trade even then, Nora continued. When supplies grew short, he raised his prices, tripled them, then tripled them again. Families who had lived here for generations suddenly couldn't afford bread for their children. But people survived. I remember things getting better. Yes, they did survive. Because of Henry Barlow. Nora turned to face her directly. He started baking differently that summer. His bread began to sustain people in ways ordinary bread couldn't. A small loaf would satisfy hunger for days. Children who had been growing weak began to regain their strength. Mothers who couldn't produce milk for their babies suddenly could. A chill ran down Maggie's spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Henry knew things other people had forgotten. Old knowledge passed down from the earliest settlers, maybe even from the native people who lived here before them. Nora's voice was barely above a whisper. The herbs that grow wild in our hills, the timing of harvests, the ways to prepare food so it nourishes not just the body, but the spirit. And Carver watched his profits disappear. People who should have been desperate to buy his grain at any price were instead sustained by Henry's bread. He tried to buy Henry out, offered him 10 times what the bakery was worth. When Henry refused, things got unpleasant. Maggie thought of Carver's warning the day before, the veiled threats in his smooth words. What kind of unpleasant? Inspections, sudden visits from county officials claiming concerns about sanitation, anonymous complaints about the smell from his oven. Sheriff Dugan was pressured to investigate reports of strange activities at night. Nora's mouth tightened. Henry never broke any laws, but the harassment was constant. What made him finally close? I don't know for certain, but I remember the last time I saw him. It was late one evening, and I was walking home from tending to my sick sister. Henry was loading a cart outside his bakery, working by lamplight. When he saw me, he looked frightened, not of me, but of something else. Nora paused, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her skirt. He told me he was going away for a while, that the bakery needed to rest, but he said something else, something I've never forgotten. He said, "The knowledge won't die with me, Ully. It's written in the stones and carved in the wood. Someone will come who understands the old ways, and then the bread will rise again." Maggie's hand instinctively moved to the wrapped journal beneath her arm. Did he ever come back? No. The next morning the bakery was shuttered and Henry was gone. Some say he went east to the cities. Others claim he died of a fever in the next county. But no one ever saw him again, and no one dared ask too many questions. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching leaves drift down from the oak trees. Finally, Maggie unwrapped Henry's journal and showed Nora the first entry. "I found this yesterday, hidden in the bakery." Nora's eyes widened as she read. "Margaret, do you understand what this means? Henry didn't abandon the bakery. He preserved it. He was waiting for someone to continue his work. But I don't know anything about the old ways. I'm just a seamstress's daughter who spent her last coins on a building everyone says is worthless. Are you?" Nora's smile was gentle but determined. "Or are you exactly who Henry was waiting for? Someone brave enough to buy what others fear, curious enough to look deeper than the surface." A sound made them both turn. Mrs. Adelaide Lyle was approaching along the path, her purple hat bobbing with each step, her face alive with the prospect of new gossip to collect. "We should continue this conversation later," Nora said quietly, rising from the steps. "But Margaret, be careful. If Thomas Carver truly believes you found something valuable in that bakery, he won't hesitate to take it from you." As Mrs. Lyle drew closer, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their meeting, Maggie tucked the journal safely away. But Nora's words echoed in her mind. "Someone will come who understands the old ways, and then the bread will rise again." Perhaps Henry Barlow's wait was finally over. The cottage at the edge of town looked as forgotten as its inhabitant. Samuel Hargrove sat on his sagging porch, whittling a piece of pine with hands that shook only slightly despite his 70-odd years. Most folks dismissed old Sam as addled, a relic whose mind had grown as weathered as his face. But Maggie had noticed how his rheumy eyes sharpened whenever someone mentioned the bakery. "Mr. Hargrove?" she called from the gate, Biscuit padding faithfully beside her. "I'm Margaret Whitlow. I wondered if I might ask you about your time at Henry Barlow's bakery." Sam's knife paused mid-stroke. He looked up, studying her with sudden intensity. "You're the girl who bought Henry's place?" "Yes, sir. 60 cents. He chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves. Henry would have liked that. Always said the bakery would find its way to someone who understood its true worth, not its gold value. Maggie stepped closer, encouraged by his words. "You worked for him, didn't you?" "Worked with him," Sam corrected. setting down his whittling. Henry didn't believe in masters and servants, said we were all apprentices to something older than ourselves. He gestured to the chair beside him. Sit, child. These old bones remember more than this old mind sometimes admits. As Maggie settled into the creaking chair, Sam's eyes grew distant. I was just a boy when I started at the bakery, 12, maybe 13. My mother was dead. My father worked the mill for Carver. Henry took me in, taught me more than just kneading dough. What else did he teach you? The old ways. Sam's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Night baking, we called it. When the moon was dark and the town was sleeping, Henry would fire up the big oven in the back. Not for regular bread, you understand. For the special loaves. Maggie's pulse quickened. Special how? Herbs, Sam said simply. Gathered at specific times, dried in specific ways. Nettle for strength, wild turnip for endurance, elderflower for fever, willow bark for pain. Henry knew where every healing plant grew for miles around. He'd make me carry sacks of them into the bakery after midnight. Why at night? Sam fixed her with a sharp look. Because some knowledge draws the wrong kind of attention in daylight. Even then, Carver was watching. Henry said the old ways had to be protected, passed down careful-like to people who would use them right. The famine summer, Maggie prompted gently. Ah. Sam's face grew solemn. That's when everything changed. People were starving, children getting sick. Carver was hoarding grain, selling it dear to anyone who could pay. Henry couldn't stand it. So he started baking the special bread for everyone. Not at first. Henry was cautious. Always. But when little Mary Prescott took fever and her mother had no money for medicine, Henry sent over a loaf of his night bread. The child was better by morning. Sam's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his pipe. Word spread, as word does. Soon Henry was baking every night, sending out loaves to anyone who needed them. That must have made Carver angry. Filling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a ode to us. Now back to the story. Furious. Sam struck a match. The flame illuminating the deep lines around his eyes. Started coming around the bakery, asking questions, brought the sheriff a few times, claimed Henry was practicing some kind of witchcraft. Course, they never found anything wrong. Henry was too clever for that. What do you mean? Sam puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. The oven wasn't just for bread, child. Henry had built something special underneath. A whole chamber, hidden beneath the regular ovens. That's where he kept the real supplies, the journals with the old recipes, the herbs that had to be stored just so. Maggie leaned forward, a hidden chamber accessible through a panel in the floor. Henry showed me once, made me swear never to tell, said if anything happened to him, someone would come who would know how to find it. Sam studied her face through the pipe smoke. Someone who could see past the surface to what really mattered. What happened the night Henry left? Sam's expression darkened. Carver came by after closing, brought 3 men with him. I was cleaning up in the back when I heard voices getting heated. Henry told me to go home through the rear door, but I lingered, worried for him. What did you hear? Carver giving Henry an ultimatum. Stop the night baking or face consequences. He called Henry's work unnatural interference with the natural order. Said people who couldn't afford proper grain deserved whatever fate God gave them. Sam's voice shook with old anger. Henry told him there was nothing unnatural about feeding the hungry. Said he'd been called to this work and wouldn't abandon it. Then what? Carver left, but his meaning was clear. The next morning Henry was gone, and the bakery was shuttered. I tried to check on him, but the place was locked up tight. Sam turned to meet her eyes directly. Henry never got the chance to show me exactly how to access the hidden chamber, but he did say this. The floor remembers what the eye cannot see, and the faithful dog will always find what matters most. Maggie's hand dropped instinctively to Biscuit's head. The dog had been pawing at that loose floorboard with unusual persistence. "Mr. Hargrove," she said carefully, "do you think Henry meant for someone to continue his work?" Sam smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. "Child, I think Henry spent his last night in that bakery, making sure his legacy would survive. The question is whether you're brave enough to claim it." As Maggie prepared to leave, Sam caught her arm. "Be careful, girl. Carver's older now, but no less dangerous. He spent 7 years believing he buried Henry's work for good. If he discovers it's about to rise again..." He shook his head. "Some men never forgive those who stand in their way." That night, Maggie returned to the bakery armed with lamp oil, a crowbar, and determination that surprised her with its intensity. Biscuit trotted beside her, somehow understanding the importance of their mission. The town slept peacefully around them as she unlocked the crooked door and stepped into the dusty darkness. By lamplight, the bakery felt different, more alive, as if the shadows themselves were watching her progress. She made her way directly to the spot where Biscuit had been pawing, the loose floorboard that had seemed so insignificant during her first visit. Working carefully with the crowbar, she pried up the board. Beneath was indeed a trapdoor, iron-bound and bearing the initials carved deep into its surface. Her heart hammered as she grasped the heavy ring and pulled. The trapdoor opened with surprising ease, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The smell that emerged was not the mustiness she'd expected, but something clean and herbal, like a well-tended garden after rain. "Stay up here and keep watch," she whispered to Biscuit, then immediately felt foolish for talking to a dog. But Biscuit seemed to understand, positioning himself near the front window where he could see the street. The ladder was solid under her hands, each rung carefully placed. As she descended, her lamp revealed stone walls that had been carved directly from the earth beneath the building. At the bottom, she found herself in a chamber that took her breath away. The hidden room was larger than the bakery above, its walls lined with shelves that held dozens of glass jars filled with dried herbs. A secondary oven, smaller but more intricate than those upstairs, dominated one wall. Its mouth was decorated with symbols that matched the carvings on the flour bins above, geometric patterns interwoven with what she now recognized as letters from an older alphabet. But it was the wooden chest beneath the oven that drew her attention. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found Henry Barlow's true legacy, 3 leather-bound journals, their pages covered with recipes, diagrams, and careful notations about harvesting times, moon phases, and preparation methods. She opened the first journal with trembling hands. "The knowledge contained herein comes from my grandmother, who learned it from hers, reaching back to the first women who settled this land. They understood what modern medicine has forgotten, that food can be medicine, that the earth provides healing for those who know how to ask." Page after page revealed recipes, unlike anything in conventional cookbooks. Bread of strength for those weakened by illness or hunger, baked during the new moon. Wheat flour, ground nettle root, dried elderberries, honey from the morning hive. The dough must rise in the hidden oven where the earth's energy is strongest. Loaves of comfort, for mothers who struggle to feed their children. Ground acorns, wild rice flour, red clover blossoms dried in shade. Bake with prayers for abundance. Healing rounds for fever and weakness. Willow bark, carefully prepared, mixed with barley flour and wild mint. The proportions must be exact, too little, and the medicine fails. Too much and it becomes poison. Each recipe included detailed instructions, not just for preparation, but for gathering ingredients at optimal times, storing them properly, and even the words to speak during mixing and baking. This wasn't just cooking, it was a form of medicine practiced in kitchens rather than doctors' offices. The second journal contained maps of the surrounding countryside, marking locations of medicinal plants with the same symbols she'd found carved throughout the bakery. The third was a record of Henry's work during the famine summer, careful documentation of which recipes helped which ailments, how much bread to distribute, and which families needed the most assistance. But it was a loose page tucked into the back cover that made her hands shake. To whoever finds this, the old ways are not superstition, but science that modern men have forgotten. The plants that grow wild around our town carry healing properties our grandmothers knew by heart. I have spent 20 years learning their secrets, testing their effectiveness, perfecting the combinations that work best with our local soil and climate. The hidden oven amplifies these properties, the minerals in the earth, the way heat circulates through stone, even the chamber's position relative to underground water sources, all contribute to the bread's effectiveness. This is not magic, but knowledge that requires respect and wisdom to use properly. Carver and men like him fear what they cannot control or profit from. They would rather people suffer than accept help that doesn't flow through their coffers. But hunger and sickness care nothing for politics or pride. The bread rises for all who need it, regardless of their ability to pay. Use this knowledge well. Feed the hungry, heal the sick. Let the earth's gifts serve their true purpose. Above her, Biscuit barked once a warning. Maggie quickly gathered the journals and climbed back up the ladder, replacing the floorboard just as footsteps approached outside. Through the gap in the boarded windows, she saw a figure moving past the building, pausing to peer toward the bakery before continuing on. Thomas Carver's man, she was certain, which meant Carver knew she'd been spending time here. As she extinguished her lamp and prepared to leave, Maggie felt the weight of Henry's legacy settling on her shoulders. She possessed knowledge that could help people, recipes that could heal and strengthen, but she also held something that powerful men had killed to suppress. The question was no longer whether she was brave enough to claim Henry's work, but whether she was strong enough to protect it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Maggie was sweeping the front steps of the bakery when Thomas Carver's polished carriage rolled up, its brass fittings gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Carver himself descended with theatrical courtesy, adjusting his expensive coat and straightening his gold watch chain. "Miss Whitlow," he called with false cheer. "I do hope you'll forgive the early hour. I was passing by and thought I might check on your project." Biscuit growled low in his throat, the hackles rising on his neck. Maggie placed a calming hand on the dog's head while keeping her expression neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Carver. As you can see, I'm making progress." Carver's eyes swept over the building's exterior, taking note of the cleared walkway and the broken boards she'd already begun replacing. "Indeed. Though I must say, the more I consider your situation, the more concerned I become for your welfare." "That's very kind, but unnecessary." "Is it?" Carver stepped closer, and Maggie caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something less pleasant, the smell of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "You see, I've been making inquiries about this property. Very interesting history, as it turns out." Maggie's grip tightened on her broom handle. "Oh, old Barlow was quite the character. Secretive fellow, always working at odd hours. Some folks whispered about strange smells coming from his ovens, unusual ingredients being delivered under cover of darkness." Carver's smile was cold, the kind of behavior that makes decent people nervous. "People bake at all hours, Mr. Carver. There's nothing unusual about that, perhaps not. But when a business fails as spectacularly as Barlow's did, well, it suggests the building itself might be cursed." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Bad luck seems to follow this place like a faithful dog." The threat in his words was barely veiled. Maggie forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I don't believe in curses, Mr. Carver. Only in hard work and determination." Admirable sentiment. "Which is why I've come with a proposition." Carver reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet, thick with bills. "I'm prepared to offer you $200 for this property. That's more than 3 times what any reasonable person would consider it worth." $200. More money than Maggie had ever seen in one place. Enough to buy a small house, start a proper business, secure her future in ways her 60-cent investment never could. "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling." Carver's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Not interested, my dear girl. Surely you can't be serious. This building is falling down around your ears. The ovens haven't worked in years. The whole structure probably needs to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Then why are you so eager to buy it? The question hung in the air between them. For just a moment, Carver's mask slipped, revealing something calculating and cold beneath his veneer of concern. Because, he said finally, I hate to see a young woman make such a foolish mistake. Your parents worked hard to leave you with something, didn't they? This investment will consume every penny you have and leave you with nothing but debt and disappointment. My parents left me with more than money, Mr. Carver. They taught me to see value where others see only obstacles. Noble words, but nobility doesn't put food on the table. Carver's voice dropped to a more threatening tone. I know what happened to Barlow, Miss Whitlow. I know why he really left town. Are you certain you want to follow in his footsteps? The implicit threat sent a chill down Maggie's spine, but she refused to show fear. Mr. Barlow's business failed. Mine won't. Carver studied her face for a long moment, then slowly tucked the wallet back into his coat. I do hope you're right, though I should mention, insurance companies can be quite reluctant to cover buildings with unusual history. Fire is always such a concern with old wooden structures. Accidents happen so easily. Is that a threat, Mr. Carver? Merely a friendly warning, from one business person to another. He tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. I'll leave my offer open for 1 week. After that, he shrugged. Well, after that, you'll be on your own with whatever consequences your stubbornness brings. As his carriage rolled away, Maggie sank onto the bakery steps, her legs suddenly weak. Biscuit pressed thests her side, offering what comfort he could. $200, enough to walk away from all of this, to start fresh somewhere Carver's influence couldn't reach. But as she looked at the building she'd already begun to restore, she thought of Henry's journals hidden beneath the floorboards, of the knowledge that could help people who had nowhere else to turn. Some things were worth more than money. Some legacies were worth the risk. 3 days later, Maggie sat in Nora's kitchen, Henry's journals spread across the scrubbed wooden table between them. The schoolteacher had agreed to help decode the more complex recipes, her education proving invaluable in deciphering Henry's careful notations. This one, Nora said, pointing to a page near the middle of the second journal. It's simpler than the others, but look at these notes in the margin. Henry used this recipe dozens of times during the famine summer, always with positive results. Maggie leaned closer to read. Bread of gentle healing, for children's fevers and weakness. Barley flour, willow bark tea, dried mint, honey, bake at moderate heat when the moon waxes. Proportions must be exact. 1 part bark tea to 10 parts flour, mint to taste, honey to bind. The willow bark is the key, Nora explained. My grandmother used to brew willow bark tea for headaches and fever. Modern doctors use something called lalison now, but it comes from the same source, so Henry was essentially putting medicine into bread. Exactly, but in doses small enough to be safe, combined with ingredients that would mask any bitter taste. Nora traced the careful measurements with her finger. It's quite ingenious, really. Children who might refuse to take medicine would happily eat sweet bread. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted their study. Mrs. Adelaide Lyle stood on the threshold, her face drawn with worry, an unusual expression for a woman who typically thrived on drama. Nora, I hate to bother you, but it's my Tommy. He's taken with fever again, and the doctor's away in the county seat. I wondered if you might have any of your grandmother's remedies. Maggie and Nora exchanged glances. Tommy Lyle was Mrs. Lyle's youngest grandson, a frail boy of 6 who caught every illness that passed through town. How high is his fever? Nora asked. Burning up. Won't eat, can barely keep water down. His mother's beside herself with worry. Maggie felt her heart racing. This was exactly the situation Henry's recipe was designed for. But did she dare try it? What if something went wrong? Mrs. Lyle, she said carefully, I might be able to help. I've been studying some old remedies, including ones specifically for children's fevers. Mrs. Lyle's eyebrows rose skeptically. You, dear? But you're not a doctor. Neither was my grandmother, Nora interjected, and she helped half the town through various ailments. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. What would you need to do? Miss Lyle asked. Desperation, overcoming skepticism. Bake a special loaf of bread using ingredients that would help reduce Tommy's fever. It's perfectly safe, just herbs that have been used for generations. Mrs. Lyle wavered, clearly torn between hope and doubt. I suppose, if you're certain it won't hurt him, I'll take full responsibility, Maggie said firmly. But I'll need access to a proper oven and some specific ingredients. Use the bakery, Nora suggested. I'll help you gather what you need. 2 hours later, they stood in Henry's restored kitchen, the main oven crackling with carefully tended fire. Maggie had managed to coax it back to life with Nora's help, and now the familiar warmth filled the space like a benediction. Following Henry's recipe exactly, they mixed barley flour with cooled willow bark tea, added dried mint, and just enough honey to create a sweet, pliable dough. As Maggie kneaded the mixture, she found herself speaking the words Henry had written in the margins. Let this bread heal what hurts, strengthen what is weak, bring comfort where there is pain. Do you really think it will work? Nora asked as they shaped the dough into a small round loaf. I think Henry knew what he was doing, and I think sometimes believing in something makes it more powerful, not less. The bread baked for exactly the time specified in Henry's notes, filling the bakery with a scent that was somehow both familiar and extraordinary, like regular bread, but with underlying notes of mint and something indefinably healing. When it emerged from the oven, golden and perfectly formed, Maggie felt a surge of pride and terror in equal measure. This was Henry's legacy made tangible, his knowledge transformed into something that could actually help a sick child. They delivered the warm loaf to the Lyle house, where Tommy lay listless in his small bed, his face flushed with fever. His mother took the bread gratefully if skeptically, and managed to coax the boy into eating several small pieces. It tastes good, Tommy whispered, the first words he'd spoken all day. By evening his fever had broken. By the next morning he was sitting up and asking for more of the special bread. Word spread through town with the speed that only good news and scandal could achieve. Miss Lyle, transformed from skeptic to enthusiast, told everyone who would listen about the miraculous bread that had healed her grandson. Before the week was out, 3 more families had quietly approached Maggie, asking if she might have bread for their various ailments. But success brought its own dangers. As Maggie walked home from delivering another healing loaf, she noticed a familiar figure watching from across the street. Thomas Carver's face was dark with anger, and his week-long deadline for her decision about selling the bakery was only 2 days away. She had proven that Henry's work could continue, that the old knowledge could still heal and help. But she had also proven to Carver that his worst fears were coming true. The bakery's power was rising again, and this time he might not be able to stop it. The acrid smell of smoke woke Maggie from restless sleep. For a moment she lay in her narrow bed, wondering if she'd been dreaming. Then Biscuit's frantic barking from outside her window sent her scrambling for her clothes. Orange light flickered against her bedroom wall, and her heart stopped. The bakery. She ran through the empty streets in her nightgown and boots, Biscuit racing beside her, arriving to find flames already consuming the front of the building. But this was no accident. She could see the splash patterns where lamp oil had been thrown against the wooden siding, could smell the deliberate accelerant beneath the burning wood. No, she screamed, rushing toward the door. Strong hands caught her arms. Miss, you can't go in there, Sheriff Dogan said, but his grip was half-hearted, his eyes avoiding hers. Behind him, she glimpsed 2 figures disappearing into the shadows, men she recognized from Thomas Carver's mill. Let me go. Henry's journals are in there, everything he worked for. It's just a building, Margaret, came a smooth voice from behind her. Thomas Carver emerged from the crowd that had gathered, his face a mask of false sympathy. Thank goodness you weren't ints when it started. These old structures are such fire traps. The patronizing tone in his voice, the careful way he'd positioned himself to watch the destruction, everything confirmed what she already knew. This was his doing. "You did this," she said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You had your men burn it down." Carver's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Careful, Miss Whitlow. Grief can make people say foolish things, accusations they can't prove." But Maggie was no longer the frightened woman who had bought this building for 60 cents. Weeks of uncovering Henry's legacy, of seeing his recipes heal sick children, of understanding the value of what she protected had transformed her into someone else entirely. "I can prove everything," she said, pulling away from the sheriff's grasp. "And I'm not letting you destroy it." Before anyone could stop her, she darted around the side of the building toward the kitchen entrance. The flames hadn't reached the back yet, and she knew exactly what she needed to save. The interior was filling with smoke, but she dropped to her hands and knees and crawled toward the loose floorboard. Behind her she could hear Biscuit barking frantically and Nora's voice calling her name. Her eyes streamed from the smoke as she pried up the board and grabbed Henry's journals from their hiding place. But as she turned to leave, a tremendous crack echoed through the building. One of the main support beams, weakened by the fire, split down its length. The sudden shift in weight caused something unexpected. The hidden trapdoor, loosened by the building's movement, burst open completely. The sound was like thunder. Smoke billowed up from the underground chamber, but so did something else, a rich, herbal scent that even the fire couldn't mask. In the orange light of the flames, the opening gaped like a mouth, revealing the stone steps that led down to Henry's secret. Maggie clutched the journals to her chest and stumbled toward the door, but it was too late to keep the secret. Behind her she could hear voices outside growing louder, more excited. Someone had seen the opening. Someone was pointing, calling others to look. By the time she emerged, coughing and soot-stained, the entire town had gathered, and they were all staring at the gaping hole where her kitchen floor used to be. "What in blazes is that?" Sheriff Dugan demanded. Mrs. Lyle pushed forward, her eyes wide. "There's something down there, steps going down into the ground." Thomas Carver's face had gone pale, his careful composure finally cracking. "It's nothing, just a root cellar, probably. We should clear the area before more of the building collapses." But old Sam Hargrove stepped out of the crowd, his usually shaky voice suddenly strong and clear. "That's no root cellar, Thomas Carver. That's Henry Barlow's true workshop, the place where he baked the bread that kept this town alive during the famine." A murmur ran through the crowd. People who had been children during that terrible summer were remembering, and their parents were remembering too. "You all know it's true," Sam continued, his roomy eyes bright with purpose. "When your children were starving and Carver here was hoarding grain, selling it for prices no working family could afford, who fed them? Who kept them alive?" "That's enough, old man," Carver snapped, but his voice cracked with desperation. "You're senile. Everyone knows it." "Am I?" Sam pulled himself up to his full height. "Then how do I remember you coming to the bakery that last night? How do I remember you threatening Henry, telling him to stop his night baking or face the consequences?" The crowd was listening now, really listening. Nora stepped forward, taking the journals from Maggie's soot-blackened hands. "Henry Barlow left these," she announced, her clear teacher's voice carrying to every ear. "Records of everything he did. Recipes for bread that could heal fever, strengthen the weak, sustain people through the worst times. Knowledge that some people wanted buried forever." As the bakery burned behind them, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the townspeople, Maggie realized that Carver's desperate gambit had backfired completely. In trying to destroy Henry's legacy, he had instead revealed it to everyone. The secret was finally out. 3 days later, the entire town gathered in the square for what Sheriff Dugan officially called a public inquiry into the fire, but what everyone understood to be a trial of truth. The charred remains of the bakery stood as evidence, the gaping hole in the kitchen floor drawing every eye. Maggie sat at a makeshift table, Henry's journal spread before her. The pages had been singed but were still readable, their secrets finally exposed to the light. Nora stood beside her, ready to read aloud for those who couldn't make out Henry's careful script. Thomas Carver sat across from them with his lawyer, a thin man from the county seat, who kept shuffling papers nervously. What had seemed like a simple case of suspected arson became something much more complicated when the townspeople refused to let the matter drop. "Let's start with these journals," Sheriff Dugan said uncomfortably. He'd been hoping to get through this quickly, but too many people were watching for him to rush things now. "Miss Whitlow, you claim these belonged to Henry Barlow." "They did." Aggie's voice was steady now, strengthened by community support. "They contain recipes for medicinal bread, detailed records of who he helped during the famine, and maps showing where he gathered his ingredients." Nora opened the first journal to a marked page. "May I read this entry? It's dated August 15th, during the worst of the famine summer." At the sheriff's nod, she began, "Young Timothy Clark came today, barely able to walk from hunger. His father has been out of work since Carver closed the secondary mill, and the family has been living on turnip water for 3 days. Gave them 2 loaves of strength bread and a small jar of nettle tea. Timothy's color was better by evening." A woman in the crowd gasped, "That's my Timothy. He's grown now, but I remember that summer. We would have lost him if not for Mr. Barlow's kindness." Another voice called out, "My Mary too. She was just a baby and I couldn't nurse her anymore. I was so weak myself. Henry brought us special bread, said it would help me regain my strength." One by one, stories emerged. Families who had been saved by Henry's night baking, children who had survived because of his herbal bread, mothers who had been able to feed their babies again after eating his carefully crafted loaves. Through it all, Thomas Carver grew paler, his lawyer more agitated. "This is all very touching," the lawyer finally interrupted, "but it doesn't prove anything about the fire. My client had nothing to do with, didn't he?" Old Sam Hargrove struggled to his feet, supported by his walking stick. "I was there that last night, boy. I heard everything." "You're an old man with a failing memory," Carver said desperately. "No one will believe." "I'll believe him." Mrs. Lyle stood up, her usually sharp face softened by remembered gratitude. "Sam Hargrove never lied to anyone in his life. If he says he was there, he was there." Nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Sam might be old, but he'd been part of this community for 70 years. His word carried weight." "Tell us what you heard, Sam," Sheriff Dugan said quietly. Sam's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Carver came to the bakery after closing time, brought 3 men with him. They cornered Henry in his kitchen, told him his night baking was unnatural interference with God's will. Said people who couldn't afford proper grain at proper prices deserved whatever fate they got." The crowd's murmur grew uglier. These were working people, most of whom had struggled during the famine, all of whom remembered the desperation of that time. Henry told them he'd been called to feed the hungry, that he wouldn't stop as long as people needed help. That's when Carver gave him the ultimatum: stop the baking or face consequences. "What kind of consequences?" Sheriff Dugan asked. "The kind we saw 3 nights ago," Sam said simply. "Fire. Destruction. The same thing that happened to anyone who stood up to Thomas Carver's monopoly on grain." Carver shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof." "Don't we?" Maggie stood as well, pulling a singed piece of paper from Henry's journal. "Henry documented everything, Mr. Carver, including this." Nora took the paper and read in her clear voice, "Carver threatened to burn the bakery if I continue feeding people. Says my work undermines his profits. Have hidden the journals and recipes in the underground chamber. If something happens to me, perhaps someone will find them someday and understand what really happened here." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Mrs. Lyle's voice cut through it. "Thomas Carver, you let children starve so you could get rich. That's not—" "I never—" Carver looked around wildly, but found no sympathetic faces. Even his lawyer was backing away. "You did," said Mary Clark, now a grown woman with children of her own. "My family would have died if not for Henry Barlow, and you drove him away. And when his legacy threatened to return," added Nora, "you tried to destroy it completely." Sheriff Dugan looked profoundly uncomfortable, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the community's verdict was clear. "Thomas Carver, you're under arrest for arson and conspiracy. We'll let the county judge sort out the rest." As Carver was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, the crowd began to disperse. But they didn't go far. Instead, they gathered around the ruins of the bakery, looking down into the exposed underground chamber. "What do we do now?" someone asked. Maggie looked at the faces surrounding her. People who had been fed by Henry's compassion, children who had been healed by his recipes, families who understood the true value of what had been lost and found again. Become something much more complicated when the townspeople refused to let the matter drop. "Let's start with these journals," Sheriff Dugan said. Uncomfortably, he'd been hoping to get through this quickly, but too many people were watching for him to rush things now. "Miss Whitlow, you claim these belong to Henry Barlow?" "They did." Maggie's voice was steady now, strengthened by community support. "They contain recipes for medicinal bread, detailed records of who he helped during the famine, and maps showing where he gathered his ingredients." Nora opened the first journal to a marked page. "May I read this entry? It's dated August 15th, during the worst of the famine summer." At the sheriff's nod, she began, "Young Timothy Clark came today, barely able to walk from hunger. His father has been out of work since Carver closed the secondary mill, and the family has been living on turnip water for 3 days. Gave them 2 loaves of strength bread and a small jar of nettle tea. Timothy's color was better by evening." A woman in the crowd gasped, "That's my Timothy. He's grown now, but I remember that summer. We would have lost him if not for Mr. Barlow's kindness." Another voice called out, "My Mary too. She was just a baby, and I couldn't nurse her anymore. I was so weak myself. Henry brought us special bread, said it would help me regain my strength." One by one, stories emerged. Families who had been saved by Henry's night baking, children who had survived because of his herbal bread, mothers who had been able to feed their babies again after eating his carefully crafted loaves. Through it all, Thomas Carver grew paler, his lawyer more agitated. "This is all very touching," the lawyer finally interrupted, "but it doesn't prove anything about the fire. My client had nothing to do with, didn't he?" Old Sam Hargrove struggled to his feet, supported by his walking stick. "I was there that last night, boy. I heard everything." "You're an old man with a failing memory," Carver said desperately. "No one will believe. I'll believe him." Miss Lyle stood up, her usually sharp face softened by remembered gratitude. "Sam Hargrove never lied to anyone in his life. If he says he was there, he was there." Nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sam might be old, but he'd been part of this community for 70 years. His word carried weight. "Tell us what you heard, Sam," Sheriff Dugan said quietly. Sam's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Carver came to the bakery after closing time, brought 3 men with him. They cornered Henry in his kitchen, told him his night baking was unnatural interference with God's will. Said people who couldn't afford proper grain at proper prices deserved whatever fate they got." The crowd's murmur grew ugly. These were working people, most of whom had struggled during the famine, all of whom remembered the desperation of that time. Henry told them he'd been called to feed the hungry, that he wouldn't stop as long as people needed help. That's when Carver gave him the ultimatum: stop the baking, or face consequences. "What kind of consequences?" Sheriff Dugan asked. "The kind we saw 3 nights ago," Sam said simply. "Fire. Destruction. The same thing that happened to anyone who stood up to Thomas Carver's monopoly on grain." Carver shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. You have no proof, don't we?" Maggie stood as well, pulling a singed piece of paper from Henry's journal. "Henry documented everything, Mr. Carver, including this." Nora took the paper and read in her clear voice. "Carver threatened to burn the bakery if I continue feeding people. Says my work undermines his profits. Have hidden the journals and recipes in the underground chamber. If something happens to me, perhaps someone will find them someday and understand what really happened here." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Mrs. Lyle's voice cut through it. "Thomas Carver, you let children starve so you could get rich. That's not I never." Carver looked around wildly, but found no sympathetic faces. Even his lawyer was backing away. "You did," said Mary Clark, now a grown woman with children of her own. "My family would have died if not for Henry Barlow. And you drove him away. And when his legacy threatened to return," added Nora, "you tried to destroy it completely." Sheriff Dugan looked profoundly uncomfortable, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the community's verdict was clear. "Thomas Carver, you're under arrest for arson and conspiracy. We'll let the county judge sort out the rest." As Carver was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, the crowd began to disperse. But they didn't go far. Instead, they gathered around the ruins of the bakery, looking down into the exposed underground chamber. "What do we do now?" someone asked. Maggie looked at the faces surrounding her. People who had been fed by Henry's compassion, children who had been healed by his recipes, families who understood the true value what had been lost and found again. "We rebuild," she said simply. "We honor Henry's legacy by continuing his work. But do you know how?" Mrs. Lyle asked. "Can you really make the bread like he did?" Maggie smiled, thinking of Tommy Lyle's fever breaking, of the other children she'd already helped with Henry's recipes. "I'm learning, and I won't be learning alone." She looked at Nora, at old Sam, at the faces of people who were ready to be part of something larger than themselves. "Henry said the bread rises for all who need it. I think it's time we proved him right." 6 months later, Margaret Whitlow stood in her restored bakery, watching the spring rain streak the new windows. The building looked nothing like the wreck she'd bought for 60 cents. The community had come together to help rebuild it properly, with modern safety features, but careful preservation of its historical character. Most importantly, they had restored the underground chamber, turning it into something Henry Barlow himself would have recognized. A working laboratory where ancient knowledge met modern understanding. "The nettle bread is ready," Nora called from the main oven. She'd taken leave from teaching to help establish what they now called the Community Bread Project, a combination bakery, clinic, and educational center that served anyone in need. Maggie wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and checked the cooling loaves. Each one was baked according to Henry's careful specifications, using herbs they now cultivated in a garden behind the bakery. But unlike Henry's secretive night baking, their work was done in full daylight, with community volunteers helping and learning. "Mrs. Patterson's baby is still colicky," noted Sarah Clark, one of their newest apprentices. She was Timothy Clark's sister, a young woman with a gift for understanding the medicinal properties of plants. "Should we send some of the fennel bread?" "Yes, and include instructions for the tea. New mothers need support, not just remedies." The bell above the front door chimed, and old Sam shuffled in, followed by a delegation from 3 neighboring towns. Word of their work had spread throughout the region, drawing people who remembered similar knowledge from their own grandmothers, or who simply needed help their local doctors couldn't provide. "These folks have come to learn about the bread," Sam announced proudly. He'd become their unofficial historian, documenting everything they discovered and connecting it to the broader tradition of folk medicine that ran rural communities, like underground rivers. As Maggie welcomed the visitors, she caught sight of herself in the polished surface of the new display case. The woman reflected there bore little resemblance to the frightened seamstress's daughter, who had spent her last coins on a broken dream. This woman stood straight, spoke with confidence, and had calluses on her hands from honest work that helped others. "The most important thing to understand," she told the visitors as she led them through the bakery, "is that this isn't magic. It's knowledge that was almost lost, but not quite. Every community has people who remember fragments, a grandmother's remedy for cough, a neighbor's trick for soothing teething babies, an old man's knowledge of which plants help with which ailments. She showed them Henry's journals, now carefully preserved and copied so the knowledge couldn't be lost again. She demonstrated the proper preparation of medicinal herbs, the careful measuring required for safety and effectiveness, the way traditional baking techniques could be combined with modern sanitation standards. But most importantly, she shared Henry's fundamental principle: the bread was for everyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. "We're not trying to replace doctors," Nora explained to the group. "We're trying to fill the gaps, to help people who can't afford medical care, to support healing with nutrition, to strengthen communities by teaching them to care for each other." Through the window, Maggie could see the small crowd that gathered every afternoon around closing time. Mothers with tired children, elderly people struggling with chronic pain, workers whose bodies ached from hard labor, people who had learned that the Community Bread Project offered more than just food. Biscuit, now well-fed and content, lay curled in his favorite spot near the warm ovens. He'd become something of a mascot for the bakery, and children who came with their families often spent as much time petting him as they did eating the specially baked treats Maggie made just for young visitors. As the day wound down and the visitors departed with armloads of bread and careful notes about recipes, Maggie found herself alone in the kitchen, where it had all started. The loose floorboard was gone now, replaced by a proper entrance to the underground chamber. But she could still remember the moment she'd first pried it up, the way her heart had raced when she discovered Henry's legacy. A soft knock at the back door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a young woman holding a feverish toddler, desperation clear in her eyes. "Please," the woman said, "I heard you might be able to help. My daughter has been sick for days, and I don't have money for the doctor." Maggie smiled and stepped aside to welcome them in. "Of course we can help. Come in, let me see what we can do." As she settled the woman and child in the warm kitchen and began preparing a gentle healing remedy, Maggie thought about the words Henry had written in his journal. "The bread rises for all who need it." She'd started this journey believing she was buying a broken building. Instead, she'd found a calling, a community, and a way to honor the legacy of a man who had understood that healing and nourishing others was the most important work anyone could do. Outside, the spring rain continued to fall, nourishing the herbs in their garden and washing the last traces of winter from the streets. Soon, new plants would emerge, ready to be gathered and prepared according to the old ways Henry had preserved. The bakery boomed with quiet activity, bread rising in the ovens, herbs drying in the rafters, the gentle sounds of a place where people came to be fed in body and spirit. It was exactly what Henry Barlow had envisioned, what he had sacrificed everything to protect. It had all started with 60 cents and the courage to see potential where others saw only ruin. As Maggie spooned honey into a cup of chamomile tea for the sick child, she whispered the words that had become her daily prayer. "Let this bread heal what hurts, strengthen what is weak, bring comfort where there is pain." The child's fever would break by morning. The mother's gratitude would spread through the community like ripples in a pond. And tomorrow, there would be more people who needed help, more opportunities to practice the ancient art of caring for one another. The bread would rise again, as it always had, as it always would. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.